Welcome to News Café. I'm Mitzi Borromeo. Tonight we explore the world of broadcast journalism as we get into the minds of veteran international broadcast journalists. Joining us tonight are CNN's Asia Pacific correspondent Andrew Stevens and Jaime FlorCruz, CNN's Beijing Bureau Chief and correspondent. Welcome to News Café, gentlemen.
Thanks, Mitzi.
Wonderful to be in the presence of veteran journalists I admire.
Not sure about the veteran bit.
I think she meant old.
Wise. All right, so we'll be looking at your experiences in the field over the years. Now, Jaime, you've been in the field of journalism for 30 years now.
30 years.
Andrew, 25. So what was it like starting out? Let's start with you, Jaime. Now, when you ended up in China, tell us that story.
Well, I ended up as an accidental tourist in China. I went there for a 3-week tour, and I ended up staying for 12 straight years, because I was stranded after President Marcos in the Philippines at that time suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which followed a crackdown, a political crackdown, and I happened to be one of the noisy, troublemaking student leaders.
Activists at the time, yes.
So I was one of those blacklisted, and I couldn't come home until '83. So I also was an accidental journalist. I happened to be in Beijing at the time when China was beginning to open up, and when news bureaus of the U.S. especially, were opening bureaus, and they needed somebody like me who was bilingual and who knew the place. So I ended up working first for Newsweek, and then I moved on to Time magazine. I worked for Time for a dozen years, and then ended up in CNN 14 years ago.
Yeah, and we'll get into that story later on. Andrew, what about you? How did it start out for you?
Yeah, I wasn't so much an accidental journalist. I always had an idea that that's what I wanted to do, but I started off in print back in the pre-PC days. So I started on typewriters and telex machines. Started at the lowest level you could possibly start at in the local newspaper, and did all the basic stuff, typing the sun and the moon and the tides and things like that, and eventually got what is a grade of journalism, and then moved around several newspapers in Australia, and then took myself off to London, as most Australians do. It's almost like a rite of passage. Australians go to London, particularly in journalism. Fleet Street is sort of the bright lights. So I went to London. I ended up being there for 6 years. Worked on Fleet Street, worked for the Press Association and the Evening Standard and the Guardian. And a friend who I'd worked with a couple of years before in Australia rang me up out of the blue to say, "Are you interested in a job in Hong Kong?" And this was in 1993, so 4 years before the handover. So I was thinking, what do I do? Do I stay in London? I'm quite settled here. Do I do Asia, the big story?
Big change.
Big change, and it was the big story. So got my feet under the desk, and then it went as a print journalist, and then TV came calling through CNBC, because I've been doing a lot of business television, business journalism. So CNBC, and then 15 years ago, CNN came calling.
Yes. And CNN, you've been in CNN for, what is it, 14 years?
Yeah, 15 years,
15
yes.
years.
14,
yes, that's right. Well, how would you compare your lives doing print journalism versus broadcast? Do you prefer one over the other?
Frankly, print, especially weekly, because it meant we had a lot of time and resources to go deeper into the story, talk with as many people as we could find, and get the context, get the subtext of the stories. Television, as powerful as it is, doesn't give you that much of time is a luxury to get into the story. But I mean, both are very exciting. It's just great to be in journalism.
You can do both. I think that's great training, to be in print first.
Yeah.
Because once you can write, you know, you have the proper training.
At Time magazine, when for TV, writing for TV, I'm just clearing my throat, and I'm told, too long.
Time is always...
Time is just the 2 paragraphs at time.
But that's the art of television, isn't it? It's getting that information, condensing it. And nice thing about television, of course, is it's that immediacy, and you can get the emotion across much more in television than it's much more difficult in print. Because I worked in newswires for a while, and I always thought that was the best grounding I could have, because you've got to get it fast, you've got to be accurate.
It's highly stressful.
It's discipline.
Yes, that's true.
And you work out what the angle is, you get it out, you get it done.
Right.
And that's always worked for me in television as well, particularly when we do live news.
Yeah.
And you're looking at a situation, you've got to size it up pretty quickly, as we know,
Yeah.
and
Right.
then make an educated call on what's happening.
I
That's
remember
right.
the first time I wrote a script for television, and it was, my typical Time magazine thing, and I thought it was good. And then he said, I gave it to the editor, and he said, well, we don't have a video for this to cover it, and we don't have the video to cover this. So okay, let me do it again. So apparently, you have to write around the video that
yes,
you
the
have.
video
Right,
and
to
visuals.
pictures, yes.
That picture.
Wallpaper. Don't use wallpaper.
Don't
Because,
use-
I was exactly the same. It's like
Yeah.
sort of, I'd write the story. Well, what pictures? Well, we'll think of something, but here's the story.
Right.
Yeah. So it's that art of telling the same story, but through the pictures.
Through the pictures.
Yeah.
That's right. There's also the challenge of the soundbite. In TV, it's like you need just a few seconds in the best time. Have you ever come across situations where you just wanted your interview to say something, and in this world, sometimes people tend to spin a few stories around. Has that happened, or you've come across colleagues who have had
I
to
think
do
we
this?
hope that happens in every interview we do.
Right. But I remember the first interviews I did for television, and my colleagues were so impatient because it's 30 minutes that I was talking with this guy and said, come on, you already had the soundbite, right? That was not my
That's him being a
approach.
journalist, I reckon. That's being the print, because you want to know one question leads to another, so
Right.
you get a
Yes.
much better
Yeah.
idea of the story.
And then later you pick the
But
soundbite.
but that slows the whole process down, so it becomes quite torturous sometimes,
Yeah.
wading through.
That's right. This is the tension, isn't it?
yeah.
Yes.
Between, right. So when you were starting out, let's ask about the studies. So what did you actually take up in college? What courses did you take up to prepare you for your current job, Andrew?
I don't think anything really prepared me for my current job. I'm a firm believer in experience,
I agree.
particularly in this industry.
So you don't have to study
You don't have
journalism.
to study journalism. I don't think
You need
so.
to read, isn't it? It's true. You have to read a lot.
You have to
and-
be curious, obviously,
Yes.
and you have to be aware. And you've got to be reasonably sort of have some critical analysis.
That's
and I
right.
think those sort of things, and you see things, and you weigh it up, and you talk, and you've been there before, maybe 2 years ago, doing something similar, and that experience plays in. And I think that's what makes good journalism.
That's true.
Yeah. I started, high school newspaper and college newspaper, but in the end, the real course, the real study is, as Chairman Mao said, you learn swimming by swimming.
Right.
So you just jump in the water and learn how
That's true.
how
You
to
learn
do
a
it.
lot. And what's also extra challenging for both of you, you moved around the world where culture also posed another challenge. How did this pose any kind of difficulties, for example? I mean, maybe there are similarities between Australia and England, but coming into Asia and then, of course, Philippines to China, what were some of the cultural challenges that you might have faced?
I think in a way, that was my strength, because I learned Mandarin for 2 years, and I had, by then, when I started in journalism, I already had lived in China for many years. So I kind of knew the culture better than most of my contemporaries, and that was very important, because there are things that you can do better in China if you do it according to their culture, or if you adapt yourself to
Yes.
the culture. You can't be too impatient.
Right.
Because there things gel over time, and that, I think that's the challenge that many of the people who just parachute in without kind of a solid grounding on culture, they bump their head.
You need to
many
be
times.
sensitive, really,
You have to be
to the people.
sensitive, and I think that's a key to success in a way.
Yes.
I
Andrew.
certainly when I came into Hong Kong for the first time, and I was in charge of a newsroom with 30 people in it, or it was a business section, and I wanted it done now, and I wanted these questions answered and those questions answered, and it wasn't coming back, and it took me quite a long time to realise I was just going about, I was at a bull at the gate. I want it now, pushing too hard and
nobody
pressing the
really
wrong
tells you
buttons.
that this is what you need to do.
Yeah,
Nobody
exactly.
actually
Yeah, no,
taught
it
you.
was trial and error, and it took a while. No,
Yeah.
Jimmy's absolutely right. It's you have to feel your way in.
Yeah.
But you have to be, I think universally, you have to be quite a good student of the human behaviour, don't you, in this job.
Yes.
You have to be able to read people.
Right.
And you have to, you have to be empathetic, I think, as well.
That's
You have to
true.
like people.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly, especially and here you really need to work as a team. As a print journalist, you're alone, isn't it? You're just writing. It can be a lonely job, but in broadcast journalism, you work with so many different people.
True.
Which has its ups and downs.
Tell me about some of those ups and downs, Andrew.
Well, it's always, I mean, it is the team thing. Particularly if you're in a zone which can be a little uncomfortable, you actually have to have a buy-in from everyone. And sometimes you're in a position where someone wants to do something and the others are saying, or one other is saying, not happy with this, so you've got to be very careful and mindful of how everyone else is thinking. And just, television is quite, it's clunky, as in that you arrive with a lot of kit and a lot of equipment and you make a fuss, and if there's a moment there, all of a sudden there's lights and there's machinery, so you can lose the moment quite quickly.
That's true.
And with print, you can go and just sit down with a notebook and talk to someone.
Yeah.
Whereas if I was talking to an old lady in the streets of Hong Kong, she was 90 years old and selling these trinkets on the street, and having a lovely conversation. I said, "Can the camera come now? Can we chat to you on camera?" She said, "Yeah, sure, come." And the whole dynamic changed, and it just didn't work. And you got to work around that all the time.
Well, a lot of fascinating stories here.
Working for time is the same. I mean, it's easier for me to blend, in the Chinese crowd. I can dress down, but it's harder when you have a team of people carrying gears.
It can be
You're
scary.
immediately saying, "Oh, these are journalists."
Especially Beijing, isn't it?
Especially
intimidating.
Beijing. Yeah, it's intimidating.
Well, we'll hear more of those stories. Time for a quick break. News Cafe will return after these messages. This is News Cafe, and we have CNN's Andrew Stevens and Jaime FlorCruz at the table. All right, we were talking about some of your interesting experiences in journalism. Let's talk about some of the interesting people or stories that you've had, you covering news around the world. Jaime, anything that comes to mind, really?
Well, in China, unlike the Philippines, people in China are camera shy. In part because they think journalists are troublemakers or could cause trouble in their lives. So they usually are standoffish toward, especially television, because there's no deniability if their face are on camera. And so our challenge really is how to get the people comfortable with the idea of talking to us in front of a camera. And it takes a lot of effort and cajoling, because after all, China is known for that, that hand in front of the camera, trying to block
a lot of censorship there.
Censorship.
Yeah.
And it's also even more difficult to get officials to come and take interviews, unlike in the Philippines where everyone wants to be in front of the camera.
Right. China, even when you're doing research, it's pretty difficult, isn't it?
Yeah.
Difficult to dig up.
So that's the common challenge that we face there.
Yes. For you, Andrew, you moved from business, you were covering economics, business, money, something that's pretty cold, no? Not very how do you humanize something like that?
Yeah, with difficulty is the answer. You have to be creative. My colleague Richard Quest is very creative at
even just his
spoiling
voice.
it.
How he does with that bell now. He's got his bell, yeah.
But you have to boil it into something that's sort of quite easily graspable. One example, we were actually in the Philippines, funnily enough, and I was doing a story on the Philippines economy, which was going very well because everything was working and moving in the right direction. Everything was kicking in. So we started off, how are we going to illustrate this? So I ended up riding a push bike through Intramuros, talking about sort of how it was a tourism. Intramuros was becoming more tourism, and tourism was one of the legs that was propping up the economy, and like riding a bike has to be balanced, and this is how it's balanced. So that's sort of how you get into it.
That's right.
A bit lame perhaps, but
very good metaphor there.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's what you got to look for.
Plus, you were on the bamboo bike. This is the
I was on the bamboo bike.
Yes, we had here recently.
Yeah, they're a little. They could do with a bit more suspension, I think.
Yes. So very interesting. Then moving on from covering stories like that to something like SARS and all of these regional stories. Do you prefer that then? Or would you like to go back?
Both have their. I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to economics. At the end of the day, economics really is what makes the world turn, as we all know.
Yeah.
And again, if to any aspiring journalist, I would say you have to know your ABCs of economics.
Right.
This is how it does it. So I enjoy doing that a lot. And business, you know, the mystery and intrigue of business, the personalities in business, fascinating. And that's what you bring to life.
Right.
But then you have the hard news, which has its own sort of difficulties and problems. I enjoy doing both. I like being an all-rounder. I really like being an all-rounder.
Yeah.
I think you've changed, you know, the approach to economics, because economics or business used to be kind of known as a boring or, you know,
the dismal
numbers and all that.
Yeah.
But actually economics can be quite interesting, and it's
Affects
storytelling
all
as
of
well.
us.
Yeah,
Yes.
and people need to know about it.
It's how you
And
tell the story.
You have to be able to explain it.
Yeah, and explaining it through people, through actual stories, I think makes it work.
Yeah.
This is where good journalism comes
Well,
in.
exactly. This is our job, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's very easy, particularly in business and economics, is you start preaching to the converted, i.e. you speak to the people, your business audience, so you end up speaking in lingo, and
the
jargon, and you think you're sounding clever. People just don't understand. Why would I listen to that rubbish?
Yeah.
Right.
So you've got to be really careful about boiling it down.
That's right. Well, speaking of economics, there's also economics in the media. Now, we know that because of commercialism ratings, sometimes media networks tend to either not tell the real story or sensationalize it. How do you feel about how certain networks, or now, I mean, with the change due to technology, some there's sort of a spin to media, or you try to, we're kind of influenced by certain, let's say, corporate entities. Do you feel like...
Never.
Do you think...
We are jealously
Is there a compromise, you
guarding that.
Yeah.
No, I think we all share that core principle of, you know, avoiding conflicts of interest or having this division between the state and the church. It's easier said than done, of course, because in reality there are different factors that will force you to do one thing or the other.
Right.
But I think it can be done, and as long as we're true to our profession, we can do it.
Yeah, and I think it has to be done. If you know, the only thing we have at the end of the day is our credibility.
Yes.
So if we can't justify an angle on a story, we're losing our credibility. And once that's gone, it's very, very hard to get back. And that's the nice thing about CNN, to be honest. I mean, they care intensely. I mean, that's all, they know that's all they have.
Yeah.
Exactly. And this is when you were on the field. Let's talk about some of the difficult experiences you had covering, for example, when you were for Typhoon Haiyan, when you were down in the ground in Tacloban. That was a very difficult... Would you say that was one of your most challenging
I'd say
stories?
that was probably the most challenging.
What was that experience like? Because it was the worst storm to hit landfall, and I mean, you've covered other disasters also.
Yes, I have. And yeah, but this was, as you say, this was the worst storm ever to have hit landfall, at least in recorded history.
Yes.
So we went down to Tacloban thinking it will be another typhoon story and there'll be a bit of damage, and we didn't expect it, and no one expected what would happen. And it was an extraordinary experience to be in the middle of it. We had some incredibly lucky breaks, and in these situations you invariably have some luck.
Right.
Our luck was to meet a storm chaser who told us to get out of a hotel where, had we stayed, we probably would have been washed out to sea.
Sounds of windows breaking, you hear the sounds of large objects falling and crashing to the floor, and underfoot it is now just a...
You ended up helping some, and that man
yes,
ended up helping
that's
some
right.
people.
We moved to another hotel,
Yeah.
and we got involved personally in the story, helping some people who got trapped in the hotel. But it was just... The whole thing was, I mean, it was a, I don't say terrifying, because I didn't feel at any stage I was in mortal danger, but it's just an extraordinary situation to be in, that intensity of nature, that amount of destruction, and then walking out as soon as we could to see just how bad it was, and to walk into Tacloban and see the devastation, see the people, just the shock of what had happened, and people were still trapped in rubble. And then just watching it all come together, sort of slowly, the help come together. The people of Tacloban start to sort of help each other. It was really, it was moving. It was very difficult. The conditions were extraordinarily difficult.
Yes, and what storytelling. In fact, CNN coverage for Haiyan won Best International News Stories at the Royal Television Society Awards, and you got an Emmy nomination So congratulations for that. But when you're down on the ground, how do you, when there are times like, sometimes in terms of media ethics, where there are times in any difficult situation where maybe you see someone in danger, but it looks like a good story, where do you draw the line? Where you put down the camera and you help, or just keep drawing, especially in war-torn areas? How do you feel about that? Where do you draw the line? Telling the good story or helping?
Well, I think you help first, and then if you're lucky, you can still do the story as what they did then. Right?
Yeah, that was you're right. I mean, I think at the end we're still humans, and we can't ignore what's going on around you. And if you are in a position to do something, I mean, I would say, and I think it becomes a very personal decision at the end of the day. But we're in a position to help, and we did what we could, and we helped. And also there was Brad, the cameraman, did some filming, so we could tell that story as well, to give people an idea of what it was like inside, what was going on inside that storm. But it's one of those issues, isn't it? Do you get involved in a war situation where you could be seen to be helping a particular side?
Yes.
They become very difficult moral and ethical issues.
Right.
And on the other side, also, we always remind our crew, ourselves, that there's no story worth dying for. I mean, in danger zones, in the end, you better, we take all the precautions and training of the crew so that we respond to danger zones in a smart way. We want to get the story, but we also don't want our crew to be in danger.
It's a good point that they value the safety of the crews so highly.
Yeah.
So they will never put crews in harm's way. And if I were asked, or if you were asked to go to a story somewhere and you were uncomfortable with it and you said no, they would totally understand.
So there's no forcing,
there's no pressure.
It
never has been.
All right. Well, good tips coming out here. We'll take a quick break. We will be right back after these messages. You're watching News Cafe, and we are joined by Andrew Stevens and Jaime FlorCruz. All right, we were just talking about the dangers of journalism. In China, of course, we know that the government tends to crack down on freedom of speech. What were some of the situations that you might have had
Our challenge in China is how, it's a very important story, obviously, and we keep on being on top of it. Our challenge really is how to convince the Chinese that by doing all sorts of stories, including negative and so-called positive stories, it's part of our job.
Activists say that the situation there remains tense, although the Chinese officials we reached in Mongolia insisted that the situation is calm. They deny that martial law was declared ever, and that they say this is just another isolated case of economic clashes, and that it has no ethnic dimension.
And yet, to many Chinese officials, that's troublemaking, so they kind of tend to shoot the messenger of the story instead of addressing the message. And so quite often we are in situations where local officials or local police try to stop us from doing what is legitimately a journalistic thing. So we've been trying to convince the officials that this is part of our job. Our core principle is we afflict the comfortable and we comfort the afflicted, and that's part of the journalist's job. But it's not easy because the concept of journalism is still, very murky, and they still don't get it.
So this still happens a lot. I mean, in China, that a lot of them are either killed or even just really
detained.
Yes. Some of these bloggers, yes.
Yes,
so
bloggers.
Did you ever fear for some of the stories you've done? Has it happened?
I've been called in a few times by government officials. They berate us for this bad story. They think they are anti-China stories. But we also tell them that, our stories, it's a combination, it's a collection of different stories. But they tend to remember the so-called negative or critical stories. And I think the solution is just to do what is reasonably a good story, and a good storytelling is what makes our stories work.
Yes.
There's a lot there has been an opening up I mean, I think some of the investigative magazines in China, there's a lot more critical reporting going on these days.
Of course, yes. And so that's changing.
Slowly, it's good to see
slowly,
that,
yeah. Because there's a new generation of Chinese journalists who also get it. And they're enterprising, they're fearless, and so they're pushing the envelope as far as they could.
Yes.
It's a work in progress.
And social media is also playing a role, isn't it?
Oh, very robust.
CNN, there's a huge, with iReport and all of these, at real time, things coming out.
But I think particularly in China, the Chinese social media.
Yes.
I mean, the Arab Spring also, all of these things happening. With your work, do you feel that now you integrate more of your journalism with social media? Do you rely on social media a lot to get...
Yes, it's increasingly important. Like, for example, just doing the Hong Kong protests, the student protests over the past 2 weeks or so. Twitter has been fantastic just for getting information, official and unofficial. I mean, we get it from the government, we get it from people we know on the streets, activists. So it's a really useful tool for us. And I think, personally, Twitter is a tool rather than sort of a social outlet.
The end.
And when things are happening quickly, I see this on CNN a lot too. Sometimes the anchor will say, well, CNN is unable to verify the source at the moment.
Right.
But when there's no other source, do you feel it's right then to just, if you have something off Twitter or something you see, is it all right then to just cite that unofficial source? How do you feel about that?
No, I think you've got to be really careful. Particularly, again, we try to be sort of a network of record in as much as we'd rather be right and last than first and wrong.
Yes.
So we're always cautious on actual saying something's happened until we know that we have a standard double source. So we've got to have double source or a special approval of a single source. Twitter, I could say there are tweets coming through which are showing a lot of anger with the government or whatever, but you're not going to see someone saying, a house is on fire, and say a house is on fire.
Yeah. Well, other risks to the job too. Now we've been seeing a lot of the news on ISIS and a lot of freelance journalists who have gone there and have gotten into some trouble. How do you feel about that? I mean, when this is another kind of journalist, so they're not really attached to a network.
Yeah, well, I mean, apart from freelancers, it's just too dangerous. I mean, and journalism history is littered with sort of adventurers and people who want to make their name by doing exactly that. I mean, you can trace it, and a lot of people have made their name, but they run an incredible risk. And ISIS is the most violent and brutal sort of group that we've seen for a long, long time. So, and as we know, what they've been up to. So, the risks these people, the freelancers now face, just gets worse and worse.
They need a lot of help. I think they need, because they don't get the support as freelancers of those who work for institutional news media. So yeah, I think we share that concern that freelancers are vulnerable to violence and so I think they need help. I don't know how we can help them, but
it's a really difficult one, isn't it? I mean, you can't send. Virtually, you can't send people into Syria.
Exactly.
Now.
We want to know the story, but we can't.
Yeah, exactly. So, we've been covering by our journalists have contacts in Kobani, for example, and they're speaking on the phone to people they know.
Yeah.
So that's how we're getting a lot of the information out now.
Yes.
But not using freelancers because it's just too dangerous.
Right. Well, going back to China, one of the problems we have with the Philippines, the tension between China and the Philippines, of course, we know with the disputed islands like the Spratlys. Do you think something like that will ever be solved? Because it's also very normally there's this paying off happening, and of course with a powerful nation like China. How do you think, will this problem ever be
Well,
solved?
I hope so, but I think it's only realistic to say that it probably will not resolve in the next months or even years. I think the Chinese are very patient people, and so in a way I think we should just be as patient. At the same time, I think we should just focus more on people-to-people engagement. I think we should not let this quarrel to impede the normal exchanges that we have, tourism, trade, commerce.
Right. Andrew, I'd like to ask you, also covered elections in many countries, a lot of significant events across the region. Elections can also be quite challenging and dangerous.
And dangerous,
Yes. What was that like? I mean, dealing with these politicians.
I mean, you think politicians in many ways are the same the world over, aren't they? You have to be very careful about what they say and how you report them. Some places it's been more dramatic than others. Years ago, being in Indonesia with the downfall of Suharto, issues like that. You treat politics like you treat any other story. You treat it with a healthy amount of skepticism, and you always check your sources, and you talk to as many people as you can. You get the feeling in the streets, and you stay aware. Yeah, I don't think there's any specific way of covering elections.
Was there
other
anyone...
than the fact that you get a lot more spin than
That's
most.
right, always a lot of spin in elections. Anyone that you particularly enjoyed or was particularly exciting, something that stands out?
Of reporting elections?
Story.
Probably the one that stands out the most is actually the election of Joseph Estrada. I was here covering that,
of course.
and that was actually that was a long time ago, but that was and it was sort of slightly surreal, really.
Quite a character.
Quite a character.
It's like a movie. Isn't it?
Yeah, I mean the movie star, and then
he's a movie
actually
star.
on the night of his election, being invited into his house and sort of being very up close and watching the whole process unfold. It was an extraordinary experience, actually.
Did you get lechon?
He must have fed you well. You know, here in the Philippines, that's what we will do.
Yeah, but no, I mean each election is obviously
also a very interesting way to understand the culture,
of
course, of a country.
Yeah.
Now, Jaime, you co-authored a book, The Massacre at Beijing, talking about the crackdown in Tiananmen Square, and they say that now the Hong Kong protests have some of that color. What do you think of?
Well, there are a few similarities. They're very different, but what I am more concerned of that is sort of similar to the Tiananmen episode was that the two sides are finding it hard to find a compromise. And that reminds me of those few weeks in Beijing, because Tiananmen went on and on for 6 weeks. And I remember sometime midway, the students, or some of the students, had declared victory and decided to go back to the campuses. And yet some other student leader said, wait a minute, we just got here. You can't possibly declare its end. So what happened was the demands of the students, the protesters, went up and up, and until the government says that's enough. And that led to the tragedy. I hope that Hong Kong can avoid this one.
Because it's looking pretty peaceful. Of course,
yes.
a little bit
it
of
was
tension
even
here
festive
and
at some point.
The cleaning up.
The cleaning up, people are polite, people are saying, sorry, I stepped on your foot.
But it's interesting because what you're saying, because the similarity to what you're saying is that the leadership will tell you in Hong Kong now, it's out of control in that they don't have the control over a significant number of people on the streets. So they can't actually channel the argument anymore. It's people are taking over, which sounds very similar. But it is peaceful. But it appears that Hong Kong, with the acceptance of China, is going to do more like an attritional thing. They're just going to leave them there until the Hong Kongers have had enough of them. And that, we're starting to see it now. There's more and more violence. There's more and more confrontation coming in. So I just think the Hong Kong protests, from being someone who's lived in Hong Kong for 20 years, it is now my home, to see how these students have reacted and how they've demonstrated in the peaceful way and the solidarity that they've shown, it's been extraordinary. And I think globally people have looked at it and thought, these guys are amazing. I mean, you know, whether you agree with the message they're sending, the way they're doing this non-violent protest is really something.
Yeah, we're pretty used to that here with our people power.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
And they're probably inspired by the Philippine version of people power.
That's right. Well, more from Andrew and Jaime when we come back. Time for a break. See you again after this quick break. This is News Café, and we are talking to CNN's Andrew Stevens and Jaime FlorCruz. It's a very exciting time now for us in Asia because we're looking into the ASEAN integration. What are you looking at? I mean, of course, big stories to come up. How do you feel about the prospects of such an integration? People are comparing it to maybe the Euro, you know. What do you think?
I think that's a bit premature, the Euro. I just sometimes wonder, there are just so many different trade blocs and groupings and economic groupings, whether they just all start overlapping and it all gets a bit confusing. If ASEAN's talking about sort of free trade and movement of labour and all the rest of it, I think probably culturally they're quite the ASEAN countries are more different than the European countries. And I think, and Europe took a long time to get, and look where it is now. I mean, look at the tensions and strains there. And is it ideal?
Right, and Asia too seems to move a bit slower. Jaime, what do you
Well, I like the fact that we could travel to all the ASEAN countries, so visa-free.
Just want to get to the beach quicker.
Yes, yeah, why not? That's good. But I think you're right. I mean, I think we should be realistic as to what we can achieve in the next few years, and what probably is going to take much longer than that.
Yeah, it takes a while to improve, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so, well, exciting times also for us here in the network, because we've now just become a part of the CNN family. So it's sort of like an integration.
Yes.
9 Media Network. So,
Welcome to the family.
Right, wonderful. It's very exciting. So we look forward to stories and partnerships together. What for you are the highlights of being in the CNN family? What would you say for you, Jaime?
I think for us, it's really learning from you as well, but also I think globally and act locally is what will make this a successful partnership. We have the brand, but you have the local knowledge, and I think if you combine that, this will be panalo.
Oh, panalo to. So it's about stories on the ground.
On the ground.
You really want to see what's happening to people on the ground.
Yeah,
Andrew?
I mean, we at the end of the day, sort of, we're all the same type of people, aren't we? No matter what country you're in. So joining the dots and that connectivity works. But as far as just CNN International, what I like about CNN International is that international bit, the fact that we are at the big story, where it matters and when it matters. And I think that's the really exciting thing about it, is that we're actually telling history and informing about events that people really need to know about.
Yeah.
So that's at that international level, and as Jimmy,
And we are genuinely interested in what's going on in the Philippines.
Definitely. I mean, it's
exactly.
growing. It's emerging. We are part of the emerging nations now. So much going on.
Yeah.
Well, just the current strains with China. I mean, that is an important story. I mean, that's an important region. That's an important global story.
Yes. And of course, you guys have covered so much, so many different beats. Are there stories or particular issues that you're really looking forward to digging into deeper? Something that might be a dream, perhaps you're thinking of a book or something, a dream, a story maybe that you've always had in mind?
North
or you've
Korea, to me,
North Korea,
is one
very
thing that
mysterious.
I've been there a few times.
And now what's happening with Kim Jong-un? What's happening?
Yeah, it's sort of like the last frontier
absolutely.
in journalism, is to find out what is going on there, what makes it such a different, distinct society.
True, because it's very difficult to penetrate,
Very
isn't
difficult.
it? Yeah.
Yeah, I must say, I can't think off the top of my head that there's some specific
There's too much to do right now.
Well, exactly. I mean, but again, the beauty of journalism is every day is a new day, is something completely left field that you hadn't thought about, and something you get involved with. It's that constant renewal of issues.
Who knew that this would happen? We would be a family.
Exactly.
Now, what do you do to relax? This is a very stressful job. I'd like to, how do you have time for your families? What do you do to unwind?
For me, foot massage and antique kind of collecting, and basketball.
Ah, very eclectic there.
Yeah, basketball.
What position do you
I'm
play?
a Filipino.
Of course. Center?
Point guard, yeah, right. Bench warming.
Yeah.
No, I like basketball. I played a varsity team at Peking University when I was in college. But yeah, it's a passion that I share with a lot of Filipinos.
Yes, definitely. Andrew?
No, one of Hong Kong's best kept secrets is it's hiking. It's a fantastic place for walking. So
you never would think that going into Kowloon or...
Well, exactly. I mean, we all see towers and concrete, but there's actually an annual race, it's a trek. It's a 100-kilometre trek over, well, it depends how fit you are. Some people do it in 12 hours. Most people do it in 30 hours. But I've set myself for things like that. Hiking, I mean, just physically. I love swimming. I've just become a part owner of a boat, which is a great way to relax because you stress so much about what can go wrong on a boat. Believe me, a lot can. Yeah. Which takes you completely away from journalism. And I read a lot and spend as much time as I can with the family, but that doesn't necessarily happen as much as I'd like it to.
That's right. Well, what is the creative process like for you? Because it also takes time to write these stories, to think them through. Any particular rituals, routines that you go through, or stories come like that quickly? I mean,
some do, some don't. I mean, some write themselves, and some just, it's like pulling teeth.
Yeah.
I don't have a process particularly. I need to, like everybody, I think better when I'm walking. So I will get all the information I think I need, type out some notes, and then go for a walk and sit in the park, and if I've got the luxury of time.
I think of some brilliant ideas while having a shower.
Yeah, it happens in the most, the funniest moments.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people think of this job as very glamorous, seeing you on TV, but it's also very difficult, especially when you have to travel light and go into difficult situations. What are some of the most, I don't know, it could be ridiculous, it could be difficult, like when you're packing for something like going into Tacloban, for example, you can't bring much. Could you tell some stories of, how difficult and challenging and unglamorous it really is?
Yeah, I mean, we all have a run bag, it's called. So if there's breaking news, you need to be on a plane. You have your passport, you have your washing kit, and sort of change of underwear and a shirt, or whatever, and off you go. I think invariably you won't pack the right thing for the right trip, and you always, worst comes to worst, you just go and buy stuff if you need to. Tacloban, obviously, we weren't. No one could have been prepared for that unless we brought in a sort of a truck with everything.
So you brought supplies, really?
Oh yeah, we got supplies on the ground, and people helped us, and we helped people, and that's how it works. Yeah, you've just got to. I mean, I think with experience, you start packing lighter and smarter.
Yeah.
I mean, because I wear a suit quite a lot, just lugging suit carriers around, it's just a pain.
Don't let it get creased.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because who likes to iron?
Bit of an expert on hotel ironing, let me tell you.
Always get the hotel to do it. Jaime?
Well, for me, it's just helping out. Carrying the tripod is the most unglamorous part of our job, right? But you do, because you're part of a team, and that's something that I think at least some cameramen were surprised when you actually offer to carry the heavy stuff, because you also have diva types, right, who just refuse to touch the heavy gears, and but it's part of our unglamorous jobs.
It even happens at, Hong Kong. I used to do we don't do it so much now, but a lot of outside broadcasts. And I remember once one of the producers, Tim, came back and said, "I've just found the perfect spot with the great view of Hong Kong." What he didn't say is that we got to the 20th floor, then climbed another 4 floors to the roof, and then there was a ladder going up to a platform and another ladder on top of that. And we ended up standing on something about the size of this table, sort of with a camera at one end and me at the other.
Wow.
And it was a great shot.
Right.
But
at some expense.
At some expense, and at some terror.
That's what your hiking prepares you for, huh?
Yes.
That's what it does.
Yeah. No, but I think generally it is. Most of your day-to-day stuff is pretty unglamorous.
It's funny, some of the things you have to do to get a good shot. Just move over there a little bit just because it's a good shot.
Yes.
And there used to be a time when a team composed of a sound man and a cameraman and a producer, sometimes even an associate producer. Not anymore, right?
Yeah, yeah.
A team of 2 sometimes.
Yeah, or sometimes now
with your
one.
phone,
Or one.
you can do it with.
Well, yeah, that's the thing, isn't
Amazing.
it? The barriers to entry into journalism have fallen so far that all you need is an iPhone.
Yeah.
Right.
On the other hand, though, sometimes anybody can be a journalist, or with blogging, there is also danger to that. That's why fact-checking is so important.
Yeah, and this is why I think I have some constant faith in our industry, because you do need that credibility. You need someone to say, "Okay, I'm actually a professional, and we've checked it out and it doesn't work," as opposed to so much noise. You just need someone to cut through the noise for you, I think. And I think that's what traditional media.
Yes.
That's our role, and that will stay our role.
Distinctive.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
Nothing like traditional media. Now, you both have been in this industry for a very long time, and you have a lot of tips to give us. What would you say? What does it take for one to survive here in this competitive and challenging world of broadcast journalism, Andrew?
Wow, that's a tough one. You've got to be flexible. You've got to have a skill set now in around industry. If you can operate a camera, if you can edit, if you're a good writer, you've got to be able to do all that. You've got to be adventurous. I think more and more now, there's a specialisation going on. So if you have a speciality, say my speciality is hot air ballooning, I could probably carve a little niche out for myself doing that if it was economics, if it was business. But it's almost like a lot of people say now you almost have to build up a following on social media before you then you bring that following into a bigger network. So yeah, just flexibility
Yeah.
and realise it's tough out there. There are a lot of people wanting to do it. Yeah, many are called and few are chosen sort of thing. It's tough.
Exactly. Jaime.
Yeah, it's the same. It's the basics are most important. Good writing skills, curiosity, good with people, patience, persistence.
Yes.
I think it's...
That's right. Well, thank you very much, guys. Jaime, Andrew, wonderful to have you here. Thank you for taking time out to be with us.
Thanks, Mitzi.
Look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you to our guests, Andrew Stevens and Jaime FlorCruz, for being on the show. And next week on News Cafe, we have The Company bringing a night of music. That's News Cafe for tonight. See you next Thursday. I'm Mitzi Borromeo. Thanks for watching. Have a good evening.
What I wanted to do, but I started off in print back in the pre-PC days, so I started on typewriters and telex machines. Started at the lowest level you could possibly start at in the local newspaper, and did all the basic stuff, typing the sun and the moon and the tides and things like that, and eventually got what is a grade of journalism, and then moved around several newspapers in Australia, and then took myself off to London, as most Australians do. It's almost like a rite of passage. Australians go to London, particularly in journalism. Fleet Street is sort of the bright lights. So I went to London. I ended up being there for 6 years. Worked on Fleet Street, worked for Press Association and the Evening Standard and the Guardian. And a friend who I'd worked with a couple of years before in Australia rang me up out of the blue to say, "Are you interested in a job in Hong Kong?" And this was in 1993, so 4 years before the handover. So I was thinking, what do I do? Do I stay in London? I'm quite settled here. Do I do Asia, the big story?
Big change.
Big
also.
change,
Yeah.
and it was the big story. So got my feet under the desk, and then it went as a print journalist, and then...
too long.
Time is always...
Time is just the 2 paragraphs of time.
But that's the art of television, isn't it? It's getting that information, condensing it. And nice thing about television, of course, is it's that immediacy, and you can get the emotion across much more in television than it's much more difficult in print. Because I worked in newswires for a while, and I always thought that was the best grounding I could have, because you've got to get it fast, you've got to be accurate.
It's highly stressful.
It's discipline.
Yes, that's true.
And you work out what the angle is, you get it out, you get it done.
Right.
And that's always worked for me in television as well, particularly when we do live news.
Yeah.
And you're looking at a situation, you've got to size it up pretty quickly, as we know, and then make an educated call on what's happening.
I remember the first time I wrote a script for television, and it was, my typical Time magazine thing, and I thought it was good. And then he said, I gave it to the editor, and he said, "Well, we don't have a video for this to cover it, and we don't have the video to cover this." I said, "Okay, let me do it again." So apparently, you have to write around the video that you have.
Right,
and pictures,
yes.
Wallpaper. Don't use wallpaper. I was exactly. TV came calling through CNBC, because I've been doing a lot of business television, business journalism. So CNBC, and then 15 years ago, CNN came calling.
Yes. And CNN, you've been in CNN for, what is it, 14 years?
Yeah, 15 years,
15
yes.
years.
14
yes, that's right. Well, how would you compare your lives doing print journalism versus broadcast? Do you prefer one over the other?
Frankly, print, especially weekly, because it meant we had a lot of time and resources to go deeper into the story, talk with as many people as we could find, and get the context, get the subtext of the stories. Television, as powerful as it is, doesn't give you that much of time is a luxury to get into the story. But I mean, both are very exciting. It's just great to be in journalism.
You can do both. I think that's great training, to be in print first.
Yeah.
Because once you can write, you have the proper training.
At Time magazine, when for TV, writing for TV, I'm just clearing my throat, and I'm told an accidental tourist in China. I went there for a 3-week tour, and I ended up staying for 12 straight years, because I was stranded after President Marcos in the Philippines at that time suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which followed a crackdown, a political crackdown, and I happened to be one of the noisy, troublemaking student leaders.
Activists at the time, yes.
So I was one of those blacklisted, and I couldn't come home until '83. So I also was an accidental journalist. I happened to be in Beijing at the time when China was beginning to open up, and when news bureaus of the U.S. especially, were opening bureaus, and they needed somebody like me who was bilingual and who knew the place. So I ended up working first for Newsweek, and then I moved on to Time magazine. I worked for Time for a dozen years, and then ended up in CNN 14 years ago.
Yeah, and we'll get into that story later on. Andrew, what about you? How did it start out for you?
Yeah, I wasn't so much an accidental journalist. I always had an idea that that's
Welcome to News Café. I'm Mitzi Borromeo. Tonight we explore the world of broadcast journalism as we get into the minds of veteran international broadcast journalists. Joining us tonight are CNN's Asia Pacific correspondent Andrew Stevens and Jaime FlorCruz, CNN's Beijing Bureau Chief and correspondent. Welcome to News Café, gentlemen.
Thanks, Mitzi.
Wonderful to be in the presence of veteran journalists I admire.
Not sure about the veteran bit.
I think she meant old.
Wise. All right, so we'll be looking at your experiences in the field over the years. Now, Jaime, you've been in the field of journalism for 30 years now.
30 years.
Andrew, 25. So what was it like starting out? Let's start with you, Jaime. Now, when you ended up in China, tell us that story.
Well, I ended up as a